First, thank you for the introduction. Thank you to all of you for coming. It's really a pleasure and an honor that some people know and some people will know later to come back to a room in which one had a great experience of intellectual formation and speak again. So thank you very much. Okay. The town of Cizre, medieval Jazirat ibn Amr, at Turkey's modern border with Syria, boasts a distinctive zodiacal bridge. Could we have the switch that is next to the door off, I think?
So you know which switch?
I know which switch. Yes. Okay, thank you. When this bridge was completed in 1164, it was not just a practical link between east and west banks of the Tigris, but also a dynamic visual expression of the causal link medieval audiences believed existed between celestial and terrestrial realms. In agricultural societies whose prosperity depended directly on seasons and weather, the idea that terrestrial fate was bound to the turning of celestial orbs made sense. In literary expression, the earth was termed the mirror of the heavens. At the Cizre Bridge, the zodiacal relief's placement on the abutment beneath the arch obscures direct view from them from the bridge. However, under changing lighting conditions of days and seasons, and in accordance with the changing position of any given viewer crossing the bridge, reflections of greater or lesser clarity of different combinations of reliefs would shimmer on the water's surface. The contrast between the white marble slabs into which the reliefs are carved and the darker masonry into which they are set enhances this effect. For medieval audiences, the bridge's shifting display of the more or less obvious presence of particular zodiacal signs on the river's surface imaged the presence of shifting combinations of astral influences in the terrestrial realm. It therefore called attention to the difficulty of pinning down these influences in desirable combinations. How talisman makers responded to this difficulty and how people could expect that their responses might actually work are the central questions of my current book project, whose working title, Petrified Powers, Medieval Islamic Talismans, also serves as the title of this talk. Although most of the objects I will discuss today date from the late Seljuk period, the project as a whole deals with talismans from the 12th to 15th centuries with a focus on objects from Seljuk, Mongol, and Timurid milieus. At the courts of this Persian, Turkic, Mongol sphere, both the realms of learning associated with the use of talismans and also the production of talismanic objects flourished. Importantly, doubts raised about talismans in the period were more often about their permissibility and the dangers that they might pose to the souls of practitioners than about their potential efficaciousness, which was widely understood to be based on observable laws of nature. Strikingly, this is the case for a wide range of authors, including establishment figures such as Ibn Khaldun, from North Africa actually, who commented on his contemporaries' views of talismans from a comparatively more conservative position. In other words, it is clear that learned, intelligent people, including those who disapproved of talismans, nonetheless believed that they could work. Following from this, the project is at its core an exploration of the relationship between actual talismans and the medieval theories according to which their efficacy was explained. I wish to understand why specific talismans and talismanic objects take the forms they do, why intelligent people might actually think they might be effective, and how their appearance relates to the ways their efficacy was historically theorized. What I want to do today is to reflect on the basic methodological premise with which I began the project, by reviewing the dialectical process by which that premise is shaping the course of my research, while at the same time my research is complicating and nuancing the premise. The initial premise was that actual talismanic objects could be brought into a productive dialogue with theories of talismanic efficacy, particularly an astrologically based theory of efficacy by sympathy. As I will explain, starting from this premise has had significant consequences for my basic understanding of what objects might or might not be considered talismanic, as well as for how I have organized my research program. At the same time, examination of actual objects has drawn my attention to the importance of multiple modes of efficacy, and has complicated my understanding of how medieval Islamic talismanic theories of efficacy relate to each other and to the objects which drew upon them. My working definition of talisman is a direct result of my methodological premise. Because my primary interest is in relating the objects to the medieval theories, it matters that I should try to make sure the objects I am analyzing are not identified by modern expectations of what a talisman might be, but rather are in keeping with the understandings of medieval audiences. Therefore, as much as possible, I am trying to use the word talisman in keeping with the usage of the term tilasm or tilsam, which is both used in both Arabic and Persian in the period. Although the derivation of our English word from this term is obvious, the semantic range is not quite the same. In English, we now tend to understand a talisman primarily as a written personal amulet, often containing a protective prayer. By contrast, some in this audience may remember that in the lecture he presented in the first talk of this series in the fall, Lawrence Nees mentioned with a citation to Marianne Berlekamp that Makrizi, whose dates 1364 to 1442 are actually more in my period than in Nees's period, Makrizi described the sculpted eagles in Al-Azhar with this word, tilsam. So he described them as talismans. That usage may have seemed somewhat strange. Actually, when Nees mentioned it, giggles erupted all over the room. But it's actually quite typical of sources of the period. In those sources, a talisman might be many things, including a monumental statue, a small sculpted figure, an image, a ring, a written tablet or an amulet, a medicinal recipe, or a shirt. Objects as disparate as these all fell within the wide bounds of the word, as long as they might have protective efficacy or protect relationships, or effect relationships. The functions of these objects included protecting a community, a household, or an individual, providing general protection from unspecified dangers, or protection in a specific circumstances, such as in a particular battle or against a particular disease or enemy, or affecting relationships at court or between lovers. Apart from the clear sense that talismans were very often statues, though not exclusively so, the usage is more clearly characterized by function than by form. So this poses a problem when it comes to developing the corpus of objects that I wanted to study for the talk and for the book. So in order to develop that corpus in a way that honors the emphasis on function found in the sources, I've sketched out a framework of chapters that are organized according to broad contexts in which talismans were used according to the literature, and so that I can then look in catalogs of objects of these types, or look for objects that appear in these kinds of contexts. So the chapters that I'm thinking of are at the gates, in the battle, on the body, into the body. I'm at an early stage in the project. I've submitted one article on a group of talismanic sculptures that adorned city walls and doors of civic institutions, so on the theme of at the gates. And I'm now working to identify a corpus of military objects whose effectiveness lay not only on practical or technological properties, but also on talismanic ones. I'm going to begin by reviewing key points that have emerged from my consideration of the first group so far, and then show how these points are influencing not only my choice of objects for the second group, but also the questions that I'm asking about them. The sculpted talismans found on walls and cities and civic institutions that I have analyzed come from a distinct region and time period and feature combined iconographic references to lions and dragons. Initially, I expected that their forms would be chosen in such a way as to allow them to operate via the theory of talismanic efficacy by sympathy, which, as I am going to explain, is, in the medieval context, an astrological model grounded in Neoplatonic views of creation. This does seem to have been the case. However, as I worked with them, it also became apparent that alternate models were at play. Rather than going through this whole corpus, I'm going to review the conclusions that I came across as I was doing this by discussing an object which first grabbed my attention some years ago, but which has recently rewarded me with new surprises, and that is the door knocker from Cizre. I'm going to show how what I have learned from this knocker has led me down some unexpected paths in my search for talismanic arms and armor, a search that has in turn complicated my thinking about models of talismanic efficacy. Cizre's great mosque, though since reconstructed numerous times, took its medieval form between 1150 and 1160. So just a few years before the completion of the Zodiacal Bridge in the same city that I showed you earlier that was completed in 1164. Its beautifully crafted doors and the knockers that graced and protected them, however, date from the early 13th century. Each knocker consists of a paired set of dragon clappers flanking a lion's head hinge. Currently, the doors, together with one complete set of knockers, are in Istanbul, and also there is one lion head hinge in Istanbul. The clappers that go with this hinge are now in Copenhagen. Additional pairs of the same type, but with different proportions and therefore likely made for other sites, also survive in London and Berlin. All of these recall a painted design in the 1206 manuscript of the Book of Knowledge of Ingenious Devices by Cizre, which was conceived for the palace for the Artukids at medieval Ahmed, or Diyarbakir. Although Cizre does not mention a talismanic function for his knocker design, both the planned use on the Diyarbakir Palace and the actual use on the Cizre Mosque prominently display the combined forces of lions and dragons at doors of Cizre region institutions well worthy of special talismanic protection. So we are not talking about only an occult popular practice of protecting small households, but about the public appearance of these objects on buildings of civic importance. In various respects, the knockers represented in Cizre's design might be considered suitable as apotropaic devices, but the ways in which the actual surviving knockers differ from the design make the actual knockers even more suitable. In both the design and in the actual knockers, the pairing of the lion head with the knotted dragons draws on astrological iconography, inviting the expectation that the knockers might be able to call on celestial powers and thereby have talismanic efficacy through the model of sympathy. While the lion then as now evoked Leo and the sun, dragons with twisted bodies were linked both to the constellation Draco and also another celestial figure known as the eclipse dragon. The eclipse dragon was a pseudo-planet, and it was conceived as follows. The idea was that when solar and lunar eclipses occurred, the Earth was not only aligned with the sun and the moon, but also with the stars that defined the head and the tail of this celestial eclipse dragon. So along with properties understood to have been vested in stones and metals in the process of creation, these forms were thought to imbue sculptures with the power to attract favorable celestial influences according to the model of efficacy by sympathy. Scholars of magic generally understand this model according to the classic formulation of it put forward by James Frazer in The Golden Bough. However, as I will explain, the way this model worked in the medieval Islamic context departs from Framer's formulation in certain critical respects. I'm going to read Frazer's formulation because when I'm in a lecture, I can't read one text and listen to another at the same time. So, if we analyze the principles of thought on which magic is based, they will probably be found to resolve themselves into two. First, that like produces like, or that an effect resembles its cause. And second, that things which have once been in contact with each other continue to act on each other at a distance after the physical contact has been severed. The former principle may be called the law of similarity, and the latter the law of contact or contagion. Frazer thereby distinguishes between magic that works through similarity and magic that depends on past contact, and scholars of magic have tended to follow this example ever since. In the medieval Islamic context, however, the distinction breaks down because similarity was understood as a result of past contact. This becomes clear when we consider the Neoplatonic doctrine of creation by emanation, which had been popularized in the Islamic world through the writings of the 10th century philosopher Ibn Sina, and which, though it was controversial, provided the foundational premises of talismanic by efficacy by sympathy, as it existed in the medieval Islamic world. In Islamic Neoplatonism, all of creation had emanated in successive stages from what was ultimately a single source identified as God. So there's God, then forms of the celestial realm, including planets and stars and astrological constellations, emanate, and then from them and through them, everything in the terrestrial realm also emanates, including metals, stones, plants, and animals. This hierarchical process lay behind the literary trope as the earth was the mirror of the heavens, and it resulted in resemblances and concomitant sympathetic correspondences between particular planets, metals, stones, plants, colors, animals, foods, and so on. So for example, because they had emanated through Mars, red things resembled Mars. And this also meant that they had sympathy with Mars, were particularly susceptible to its influence, and could attract its influence. In other words, when we consider how efficacy by sympathy was understood, Fraser's distinction between similarity and contact becomes a moot point. Rather, the key point is the notion that through sympathy, which had resulted from historical contact and could be detected through resemblance, earthly forms could attract corresponding celestial ones. The forms in the knockers then could attract the powers of the celestial forms they resembled. Further, the roles of key figures at court were each associated with a different planet and a different zodiacal sign, with the prince figured as the light-giving sun, and so is Leo. So in the layered heraldic astrological iconography, in which the prince is positioned as lion among men and light of his court, the central position of the lion's head from which the dragons turn away suggests that the prince succeeds in driving out the forces of darkness. But the knockers are also efficacious according to another model of efficacy, that of symmetry. In Cizere's design, as in the actual knockers, the dragon's open jaws accentuate their ferocity, and the knots of their reptilian snake-like torsos suggest the snapping volatility and power of a tightly wound spring. The bodies in the actual knockers also terminate in birds' heads. The symmetrical pairing of two unruly dragons suggests that they may have been expected to work through the theoretical model of symmetry based on the idea that like counters like. This idea, found in numerous cultures, had deep roots in the region's classical heritage, as Christopher Faraoni makes clear in his study of talismanic sculptures in ancient Greece. The idea remained prevalent in the medieval Islamic world, and indeed, Faraoni uses the 10th century Arabic historian Mas'udi in order to explain what this model means. According to Mas'udi, Alexandria was repeatedly attacked by sea creatures. In response, Alexander the Great contrived a glass cage which would allow artists to be suspended deep into the sea where they could see these creatures and record their forms. Then, Alexander ordered that on the basis of this careful research, statues of the likenesses of these creatures should be made in metal and stone. The statues were placed around the perimeter of the city, and the attack stopped. Versions of this story continued to circulate in later medieval and early modern Islamic literature. Writing about the turn of the 14th century, the poet Amir Khusro Dehlavi mentions a version of this story in his Khamsa. A manuscript of his Khamsa, produced in 1597-8 in Mughal India, features a painting in which Alexander himself is shown being lowered into the sea in a glass cage. According to the logic of this model, the dragons in the clappers of the Cizre knockers show the fearsome likeness of potential enemies. The enemies, recognizing their own true character and themselves in the depiction, are expected to recoil away and turn away in terror. In the actual knockers, but not in the design, the dragons turn their heads away from each other, as if each is driven back by its own image. Further, I have recently become interested in the defining characteristic of the knockers as such. They are bronze objects with movable parts designed to produce a loud, audible clap. Knockers knock. In the actual knockers, as opposed to Cizere's design, the paired dragons are linked not only by the bird-headed tails, but also by mammalian forelegs. This would give them additional structural integrity as clappers in the event that they might be banged against the door with force. So could the knocker's audible knock have been understood to contribute to their talismanic efficacy? If so, considering them in relation to other knockers might help us understand how. The group defined by the Cizre knockers may be considered in relation to other examples of bronze knockers from the medieval Islamic world broadly defined. One on the left, now in Paris, has been attributed to the Cizre region in the late 12th or early 13th century. The stout and angular lion's head at its hinge recalls the lion's head in the Berlin knockers that are like the Cizre ones. Rather than the full bodies of a single pair of dragons, this Paris clapper consists of a ring composed of 5 pairs of confronted dragon heads. Another knocker, now in Copenhagen, may have been made in Sicily or southern Italy, where Muslim artists were active into the beginning of the 14th century. It does not feature any dragons at all. Instead, it is dominated by a large lion's head who holds a ring in his mouth. At the bottom of the ring, the clapper consists of a small bird's head, recalling the heads at the bottom of the Cizre knockers. The lion's head is surrounded by a Kufic inscription with the Muslim profession of faith. Joachim Meyer and Peter Northover have studied the lion knocker in Copenhagen, noting that the bird in the clapper may be a cock. And they cite a hadith most people in this audience know that's a report of what the Prophet Muhammad said or did, suggesting that the cock, like a lion, is a loyal friend and formidable foe, suitable for deployment on a door. The hadith included in Bukhari's classical compilation relates that the Prophet Muhammad identified the white cock as the enemy of God's enemy and the guard of mansions. While Northover and Meyer shy away from explicitly considering the knocker as a talismanic object, the culturally established idea that the cock, like the lion, is an appropriate guard has obvious implications for its talismanic efficacy. Meyer and Northover also mention the phenomenon of medieval Islamic metalwork objects which have been interpreted as speaking through their inscriptions, and suggest that through its sonic knock, this knocker might have been thought to audibly speak the profession of faith with which it is inscribed. While I agree that the sound of the knock is an important component in interpreting a knocker, it seems to me more obvious and more relevant to the knocker's acotropaic function to link the sound of the knocker to the sound of the creatures represented. In the Copenhagen knocker, analyzed by Meyer and Northover, the knocker's loud clang would seem to evoke the loud crow of the cock and the loud roar of the lion. Likewise, the Paris knocker resounds with the lion's thunder and the lion's roar and the dragon's thunder, and the knockers of the Cizre group resound with the cock's crow, the lion's roar, and the dragon's thunder. How might the sound of these beasts have been thought to enhance the talismanic efficacy of the knockers? This seems to be the sonic parallel to the widespread medieval trope of beasts who can harm or kill through their very appearance. In my previous analysis of this trope, I have explained that the idea that a beast might have lethal appearance depends on the medieval theory of vision by intromission, according to which forms actually enter the eye, the bodily side of the sense of sight. The trope can be found in various texts, including, interestingly, an Arabic medical text by a 10th century author, Ibn Wahshiyya, entitled The Book of Poisons, and this has been translated by Martin Levy. The extensive manuscript history of this book shows clearly that along with his other works, or Ibn Wahshiyya's other works, this continued to be copied, read, and studied for centuries to come. Like his better-known work, Nabatean Agriculture, which was frequently cited by later authors, including Qazwini, died in 1283, and Damashki, who died in 1327, and like his treatise on ancient alphabets, the Book of Poisons is a rich source for art historians. Ibn Wahshiyya's first chapter specifically treats poisons that are lethal by sight, including not only particular beasts, but also particular materials. The first such poison mentioned is a kind of snake from the land of the Turks. As for what kills from a distance, there are snakes which exist in the valley of the Khazluj in the land of the Turks. If a man sees these snakes, he dies. And if the snake looks at him, he dies immediately. This was in truth observed at that place. And this is a very common trope. You can substitute different beasts, but okay. So Ibn Wahshiyya then goes on to mention a black marcasite stone of iron whose appearance is similarly lethal, along with its antidote, a small green feathered bird. According to him, if on seeing the stone one also by chance at the same time sees the bird, then the lethal power of the stone will be destroyed. Alluringly provocative allusions to Turkic origins, snakes, lethal metals, and simultaneously visible bird forms aside, the fundamental reason that the passage quoted above lends itself so readily to juxtapositions with the visual forms of the Cizre knockers is that it comes from the chapter on poisons lethal from sight. This is in fact Ibn Wahshiyya's first chapter, followed in turn by chapters on lethal sounds, lethal scents, poisons in food and beverages, and poisons fatal by contact. Of these, his chapter on poisons in food and beverages might seem at first to correspond most closely to our own modern idea of poison as a substance that does chemical harm once it has been ingested. But the organization of the chapters suggests otherwise. As Ibn Wahshiyya himself notes, what we have here are poisons that can kill through the five senses. In such a scheme, poisonous foods and drinks are lethal not so much by ingestion as by taste. Essentially, then, Ibn Wahshiyya's respective chapters treat poisons lethal by seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and touching, of which the first two receive by far the most attention. This way of conceptualizing poisons begs the question of how the knockers defining kinetic quality, their audible knock, augmented their efficacy as protective devices. No specific passages from Ibn Wahshiyya lend themselves to juxtaposition with the knockers as neatly as the passage I already considered from his chapter on fatal sights. However, in an introductory discussion that explains the concept of poisons lethal by sound, he does call attention to the dangers of various sounds that are loud and sudden, and implicitly acknowledges the specific dangers of loud knocks on doors. Thunder is said to kill chicks because it is sudden. The beat of a panther skin drum is said to be lethal to a gazelle under certain conditions. And although he does not say directly that loud knocks on doors can be fatal, he does seem to take it for granted that they can be dangerous. Accordingly, he offers an antidote-like solution, suggesting that people inside a structure should protect themselves by loud knocks by hanging on their doors a water skin filled with air. All this suggests that as we consider how objects such as the Cizre knocker may have been expected to strike effective blows against an enemy, we should keep in mind that they may have been designed to take advantage of enemy susceptibility to harm through the senses of both sight and sound. And as an aside, I'd like to suggest that the knockers might not have been the only kinds of sculpted apotropeia which might have been expected to work partly through sound. The same may have been true of some large bronze zoomorphic sculptures, such as the famous Pisa griffin and its smaller, lesser-known cousin, the New York lion. The griffin, which may have been made in Spain in the 11th or 12th century, was perched on the top of the Pisa Cathedral by the 15th century at the latest, and it stayed there until 1828. The placement would certainly have been appropriate for an apotropaic function. Recent examinations of both the griffin and the lion have revealed that the two of them were both fitted with internal pipe systems. And although it has not been possible to test this, it seems likely that the pipe systems may have caused these bronzes to sound in a manner analogous to bagpipes. And this, I suggest, could have augmented their efficacy as apotropeia. How this relates to models of sympathy and symmetry is a question to which we will return later. At present, I'd like to turn to how my reflections on the knockers and related forms from the at the gates portion have established a template for my initial research into talismanic objects in the battle. Texts containing talismanic recipes repeatedly mention talismans for use against military enemies, but the task of determining which surviving military objects were likely considered to have talismanic qualities is somewhat more difficult than the task of identifying apotropaic sculptures. When the original placement of the sculptures at doors or gates is known, the locations make their talismanic potential more obvious. Arms and armor, by contrast, present all the challenges typical of portable objects, and further, all of them were designed for at least one of the characteristic purposes of talismans. That is, they either inflict harm on an enemy or they protect the user from harm. So the question then becomes one of identifying which military objects might have achieved these purposes by talismanic as well as practical means. To do this, it has been helpful to approach the objects with an eye already aware of the talismanic qualities of sculpted talismans such as knockers. Several objects from the arts of war of the period share with the knockers qualities that contributed to the knockers' talismanic efficacy. As in the knockers, lions and dragons are favored motifs, and as in the knockers, the dragons often appear in symmetrical pairs. A quillin block in the middle, now in the collection of the Photosia Foundation, like the knocker from Paris, features paired heads of stylized lions emerging from necks that join in a seamless curve. As on a later 15th century Timurid sword, which this also has the dragon quillin block. So as on this sword, the heads would have curved downward away from the hilt or handle. However, the earlier Photosia Foundation quillin was probably for a short dagger with a straight blade, which would have been here. So this is the handle, and then the blade would have been below, and it would have been straight and short, as opposed to this long curved blade of the sword. Although this copper alloy quillin and hilt guard, which is inlaid with both gold and silver, would have belonged to an ornate dagger, the quillin also had a practical purpose. It prevented the warrior's hand from slipping down onto the sharp blade of the dagger. Consideration of the precise placement and position of the dragon's heads with respect to the rest of the dagger shows how this practical purpose would have been augmented by the talismanic features of the form. The base of the sharp blade would have been trapped by the open-jawed dragons. As the dragon's heads on the knocker turn away from the lion head hinge, and here I'm returning to the idea of the lion as the prince. Here, the dragons turn away downward from the wielder of the weapon. As in the knockers, the dragon's iconographic form lends them sympathy with celestial dragons, while the symmetrical arrangement visually echoes the idea of talismanic efficacy by symmetry, based on the idea of symmetry between adversaries. The model of symmetry between adversaries would have been particularly suitable for a dagger because it was a close combat weapon. As such, it would have been used in battle when the warrior met his match. Later Persianate court culture offers many instances in which meeting one's match in battle and meeting one's match in love are conflated. A 14th century example may be found in 1388 Divan of Khwaja Kirmani. This painting depicts the moment in which the Chinese princess Humayun, who has been battling her lover Humai in disguise, removes her helmet and reveals herself to him. And so at that moment, he figures out who she is. And Teresa Fitzherbert has drawn attention to the mirroring quality of the scene with its paired trees and horses, also the paired pendants, the paired bows here. And she has related this quality to the moment of recognition between the lovers. There's a mirroring of egos and a mirroring of the various effects in the scene. Interestingly, both of them are wearing on their armor a pectoral disc over this kind of lamellar armor, which is made out of various pieces. Historians of Islamic arms and armor agree that such discs were actually worn over this type of armor in this period, as well as over chainmail, as shown here. Further, although the point tends to be made in passing and without analysis, they also agree that these discs had both practical and talismanic significance. According to Manuchehar Moshtagh Khorasani, they were known in medieval Persian as Aynei Chini, or Persian mirrors. He's a scholar who's done several catalogs of collections of arms and armor, as well as an exquisitely geeky lexicon of arms and armor terminology in Old, Middle, and New Persian. So I feel that he's the person who's probably thought the most about what it would have been called. Given that Humayun's beloved, and in this case also his adversary, Humayun, is a Chinese princess, the detail and the terminology of the detail is particularly resonant for how the painting plays with mirroring to amplify the theme of recognition and identification, not only between matched lovers, as Fitzherbert notes, but also between matched battle foes. Fitzherbert also points out that the couplet that's most literally pertinent to the scene reads, "When the love-nourishing king took his dagger, the fairy-faced one drew the helmet from her head." For our purposes, it is interesting that in this couplet, the dagger serves as the poetic pivot for the conceptual collapse between a match between warriors and a match between lovers. From the 15th to 17th century, there survive several actual swords inscribed with poetic verses that express the same collapse. One, an Ottoman sword now in Vienna, contains a verse ending with this couplet, which was translated by Cornel Fleischer. "I beg you, kill me not with an arrow. Instead, show me the grace to kill me with a sword, because then I shall fall to the ground close to you." These observations obviously open up other lines of inquiry, but the present point is that whether in painting or poetry, whether in a lyrical narrative or on an actual sword, the poetic conflation between battle match and love match spoke to the intensely personal experience of recognition and identification that characterized both close combat and love. And this is why the mirrored pairing of symmetrical dragons on the Quillen block and the model of talismanic efficacy through symmetry that it evokes seem particularly suitable for close combat weapons, such as daggers and swords. However, swords and daggers were not the only close combat weapons with talismanic qualities. The other major close combat weapon, other than the sword or dagger, was the mace, of which I show two examples here, both from the Photosia collection. Both of these maces, one with the head of a lion, the other with the head of a dragon swallowing a bull, may well have been used in a ceremonial manner, but also would have been quite effective as actual weapons. We know this because both belong to a particular type of mace, which is very strong, which was called armud in Abbasid sources, which is characterized by the head and the handle being of one piece, so that when you smash it, the head doesn't break off. This one is all iron, and it's entirely of one piece. This one has an iron core that continues to an iron head that is then surrounded by this copper alloy on the outside. The dragon-headed one, oh, one more point about the Amud. There's Noel Adams, who wrote the introduction to the section on maces in the Farusiya catalog, cites an Abbasid period manual on horsemanship, which states that the Amud is among weapons like a lion among the animals. The dragon-headed one at the right is now 35 centimeters long. It looks to me like it may be broken at the bottom. And as I said, it has a copper alloy over this iron core, and it is attributed to 11th to 12th century Seljuk Anatolia. The lion-headed one at the left is 62 centimeters long, iron, and attributed to 12th to 14th century Seljuk Iran. There are also closely related examples that are older, such as this 9th to 10th century Ghaznavid mace head in the form of a collared leopard. In Persian poetry and painting, these and other zoomorphic types of maces are associated with both medieval and ancient rulers, a classic example being the ox-headed mace that appears frequently in the Shahnameh. Adams notes that medieval audiences were well aware of the antiquity of the mace as a weapon type, and that this added to the authority they communicated as ceremonial objects. He also suggests that some zoomorphic iconographic combinations found on medieval maces may have drawn on pre-Islamic Zoroastrian cosmology and astrology. While it is possible that the maces were meant to evoke specifically Zoroastrian cosmological references, it also seems possible that they were seen as belonging to an ancient pre-Islamic tradition and yet at the same time interpreted within medieval astrological frameworks, which were in any case quite syncretic in their approach to the heritage of ancient astrological traditions. The medieval astrological significations of lions and dragons that made them appropriate guards for doors also made them appropriate allies on the battlefield. Further, the lion not only signified Leo and the sun, but along with other felines, it seems to have been associated particularly with the planet Mars, the planet of war. One complicated, yet in my view useful source for checking how astrological knowledge was visualized in a Seljuk milieu is the compilation known as Daqa'iq al-Haqa'iq, after the title of one of its 5 texts. The manuscript, Persin 174 in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, was presented to the Seljuk prince Ghiyath ad-Din Kay Khosrow III by his courtier and astrologer Nasruddin al-Haykali in 1272 and 1273. Although its pages are not in their original order, Francis Richard has determined that it is comprised of 5 texts. 4 of these treat astrology and the related subjects of geomancy, talismans, and days of the week, while the 5th has a eulogy to Kay Khosrow and poems dedicated to various mystical Persian poets. Marianne Baruchon has determined that most of the illustrations, including this one, were probably done in a late 13th century workshop that likely had access to Byzantine, and she specifies southern Italian sources, but also that the project was not completed right away. The image spaces that were initially left blank were provided with paintings in 2 subsequent campaigns, which Baruchon dates to the 15th and 16th centuries respectively. Baruchon notes various stylistically hybrid aspects of the 13th century illustrations. For example, in this image of the conjunction of the moon and Mars, she calls attention to the warrior's iron stockings and also the helmet, which look more Western than the rest of the image. All these points seem logical, but she then concludes that both the hybrid stylistic character of the 13th century illustrations and the fact that the illustration program was not finished all at once should be explained by a lack of pictorial models for this type of text. The implication is that the artists trying to illustrate the manuscript in the 13th century were often at a loss for how to proceed, either reaching desperately far afield for models or just giving up and leaving image spaces blank. If this were the case, then one would need to be quite cautious about assuming that their paintings could reveal very much about the broader visualization of astrological concepts in a 13th century Seljuk milieu. However, the phenomenon of initially unfinished illustrated manuscripts receiving later paintings is extremely common. And as for the cross-cultural aspects of the 13th century paintings, Oya Panjarolu, who was kind enough to share with me the English language version of an essay that she published in Turkish in 2006. Pancaroglu offers the insightful comment that the combined style of the paintings is actually quite appropriate for the topics being illustrated, as, like much else, topics such as astrology were the shared heritage of Byzantine and Islamic Anatolia. It therefore seems to me that the complications of the manuscript need not prevent us from looking to its 13th century illustrations for readily available examples of how astrological knowledge was visualized in Seljuk book learning. In this example of the conjunction of Moon and Mars, we see Mars, but not in any obvious way the Moon. Mars appears as a red-headed warrior holding a sword and a severed head, as is typical for his iconography. Additionally, he grasps a lion-headed mace, wears a red robe, and is accompanied by a collared feline. The image appears in a series illustrating conjunctions between the Moon and various other planets. And so there are certain aspects of this image that conform to the rest of the series. Notably, in each case, you see the personification of the planet that is supposed to be in conjunction with the Moon, but the personification of the planet has more arms and more attributes than usual. I would posit that the logic behind this compositional pattern may have been as follows. The Moon is considered munificent, and so it would tend to intensify the desirable qualities of the other planets when it came into conjunction with them. So it may be that this is visually expressed by adding more attributes and making more of them visually available at the same time. The lion-headed mace form, along with red clothes, dark red stones, iron, fire, hot spicy food, and actions performed on Tuesdays, would not always have been considered talismanic. Yet it does seem from the Daqa'iq illustration that, like these other things, it was understood as capable of possessing sympathy with Mars. Since iron was also understood to possess sympathy with Mars, it seems logical that the potential talismanic efficacy of a lion-headed mace made entirely of iron would have been particularly strong. Further, I suspect that the fact that medieval audiences understood the lion-headed mace to be an ancient form would also have been relevant. When we look at a piece of petrified wood today, we see an inextricable melding of form and material. Through that melding, we see geological time and process in the object. I suggest that in the right circumstances, the experience of medieval audiences looking at an object such as this mace would have been somewhat similar, but on a larger scale. That is, when they looked at the object in terms of its talismanic potential, they would have seen cosmological time, process, and motive power in the combination of form and material. So this is a sort of a poetic thought, so I'm going to say it as follows. This Amud, lion of weapons, forged of iron, metal born of Mars, its shaped testimony to a link between distant past and tangible present, might draw on the power of its past, even of its cosmic origins, and call the full fury of Mars into battle. Another class of military objects in which we can find visual characteristics related to the talismanic properties of the knockers are drums. We now think of drums as musical instruments, but there is a good reason that the beat of the drum features so prominently in martial music. Medieval armies used drums in battle, sometimes to sound signals, but often in a manner that could, from our modern point of view, be understood as psychological warfare. Loud, sudden bangs could intimidate, distract, and terrify. And as a telling aside, it is worth noting that gunpowder and fireworks were often used in a similar way. In the Seventh Crusade, there's a French sire, Jean de Genville, who accompanied Louis IX on this crusade, and he described the use of gunpowder at Mansoura in 1249. What he said was that it sounded like thunder and it looked like a great fiery dragon flying through the air. It is therefore worth considering drums as instruments of battle and how their power might have been augmented through their potentially talismanic qualities. This bronze drum, at 65 centimeters high, is attributed to the Cizre region in the 13th century. And it's published in the Turks catalog that David did with a catalog entry by Oya Pancaroglu. The Kufic inscription has not been read. The letters terminate in the heads of humans or of dragons. So we have the letters sometimes with human heads, and then sometimes with dragon heads. All of them are set against these vegetal scrolls. Though many of the scrolls are positioned in such a way that they flank the heads and frame them by flanking them, in a few cases they instead surround them. You can see one that's kind of like that over here. And also the dragon's head is surrounded by the scrolls. In the case of the dragon's head, the spiral not only surrounds the head, but spirals inward so that it terminates in this vegetal piece that is obstructing the dragon's open draws. The verticals of the letters also all have a distinctive characteristic twist. That twist recalls the twist in both Cizere's design and the Cizre knockers. It's a very sort of clean loop, and the proportion is somewhat similar to the overall proportion of the verticals of the letters as well. Although, as I mentioned, this twist is associated with the iconography of the eclipse dragon, twists in apotropaic dragons have also been explained as talismanic knots. The tying of knots, which is specifically condemned in the Quran, was a widespread pre-Islamic talismanic practice that did seem to survive into the medieval period. The idea behind it is that one can use knots to embroil one's enemies in knotty problems, to make things for them tangled, obstructed, and difficult, rather than unfettered, open, clear, and easy. This raises the possibility that the twists in the Kufic letters of the drum might also vest it with potential talismanic efficacy. And while vegetal scrolls such as these are certainly a very common ornamental device, it might also be possible to see in the scroll that twists towards an obstruction of the dragon's mouth not only a visual echo of the twists in the letters, but also a conceptual echo of the idea of the talismanic knot. While today we would classify sonic intimidation as a psychological tactic, Ibn Wahshiyya would have classified it as a poison that harms through sound. In his chapter on such poisons, he gives several lengthy recipes for making and using drums to kill enemies. Fascinatingly, these recipes are conceptualized as astrological, and it is clear from reading them that the sounds of the drum are considered to work most effectively as poisons when they invoke the correct combination of astrological forces. Therefore, they are accompanied by instructions on operations that the user of the drum should perform to invoke protective forces as well, so that the talismanic power of the drum does not backfire onto him. And this is actually a problem with talismans backfiring that sometimes comes up. So the recipes are very long, so I'm just going to try to summarize one. The first part explains how you tan a lamb skin in a sort of a ceremonious way with very specific ingredients. Then one is supposed to put this skin in a jar with 3 snakes and leave everything covered from a Tuesday until the following Tuesday. And then one is supposed to make of a mixture of opium and wine, things in the form of little delicate hazelnuts, which you drop in there and leave them for 3 days, and the snakes eat them and are poisoned. So 3 days later, you get the dead bodies of the snakes out and you burn them. Then it describes how one should make the base of the drum and how one should choose a stick of olive to sound the drum. Then it says, when the sun sets on a Tuesday evening, take the drum and the stick and set them down facing Mars. If the moon adjoins Mars, that is best. Otherwise, do it while Mars is rising. The instructions then continue that one should take the stick with your left hand such that the outside of your hand with the stick and the drum agree with Mars. And then there follows a long incantation addressed directly to Mars, which was rather shocking to me. This includes 8 repetitions of the phrase, "Kill with this drum everyone who hears its voice." However, the operation is not complete until one burns laurel seed, mustard seed, and storax in a center, stands up in the appropriate way, and then calls on Mars not to kill oneself in accordance with one's protection from Jupiter. Then there's an entirely separate set of instructions for how to call down Jupiter to protect one from the drum. Equally long. This has obvious implications for the question I posed earlier about how the efficacy of talismanic objects that might harm through the sense of sound might be related to broader theoretical frameworks of talismanic efficacy. Ibn Wahshiyya's instructions explain how to activate a drum as a lethal weapon that is safe to use by calling down both Mars and Jupiter. What this shows is that at least some of the time, the efficacy of talismanic objects that harm through the sense of sound, was subsumed into the framework of efficacy by astrological sympathy. One might then ask whether the same is true of talismanic objects that harm through the sense of sight. However, the case of the dangerous enemy who is thwarted by seeing its own likeness is instead the quintessential example of talismanic efficacy by symmetry. At the same time, the case of the enemy terrified by its own likeness is only one kind of a talisman whose effect depends on sight. Many of the poisons by sight that Ibn Washia mentions bear no suggested visual resemblance to the enemy they are meant to thwart. Indeed, for Ibn Washia, the crucial theoretical point behind all of this seems to be that all of his poisons are based on nature. He explains, quote, "When we, our ancients and wise men, saw that nature had manufactured things which are lethal by looking at them and things which kill by hearing their sounds, we and they know that we have the possibility and the power to imitate nature and to make what it makes." Similarly, he notes that poisons that kill through sound and sight are both, quote, "deeds of nature which enter the soul by these two ways, hearing and sight." The idea is echoed by Ibn Khaldun. His view is that although the souls of talisman makers are in danger because they appeal to the stars rather than appealing directly to God, nonetheless, the fact that their work is based on observable laws of nature also gives them a practical advantage when it comes to producing desired results. The recurring idea that talismanic efficacy is based on nature does give some primacy to the model of astrological sympathy, but it does not reconcile all the models of talismanic efficacy into a single cohesive model. Like some talismans that work through sound, some that work through sight depend on theories of sympathy, while others depend on theories of symmetry. Likewise, Ibn Khaldun specifically mentions that some practitioners who work with letters base their work on correspondences between letters and planets, while others do not. And there's a text of the Ghayat al-Hakim of Majriti, which is one of the most extreme kinds of magical texts, which even includes an entire schema for associating different verses of the Quran with different planets. But that certainly would not mean that every amulet that has a Quranic verse on it was meant to function in an astrological way. What emerges from examining the actual objects in light of this complicated theoretical backdrop is this. 1, no surviving single object precisely corresponds to any given talismanic recipe, but why should we expect it to? The recipes of different authors do not precisely correspond to each other either, and it makes sense that the designers of talismanic objects would have put together their own recipes as the occasion required. Instead, the theories and the objects do follow related conceptual templates. 2, neither does any single object offer itself as a perfect match for any single talismanic theory. Instead, the objects seem designed to layer multiple models of efficacy. This is paralleled in an artistic tendency to use motifs in such a way that they draw on multivalent resonances as opposed to consistently signaling single iconographic meanings. And it parallels a theoretical tendency evident in the talismanic recipes to use multiple means to achieve the same ends rather than relying on any single strategy. So in the end, in researching this topic, there are no easy one-to-one correspondences between visual and textual sources, yet juxtaposing the two ultimately allows one to understand both in a richer way. Thank you.